Today on the Everyday Rose Show, it's all things David Austin Roses with their U.S. sales executive and my good friend, Rebecca Koraytem. We're going to talk about a lot of really fun stuff today. You know, the breeding program, what is a David Austin English rose? We're going to meet some new roses, maybe meet some old roses as well. Care tips, companion plants, all kinds of stuff. So you know what? Let's go meet Rebecca.
Becca, it is so nice to talk to you again. I feel like it's been forever. I was always used to seeing you with the Biltmore International Rose Trials when you were a judge and you lived close, and seeing you, and of course now you live in Seattle. But welcome to the Everyday Rose Show.
Oh, I thank you. It is truly a pleasure. And Paul, I have you to thank for even being in the position I am, because I attended a rose seminar you did for the Organic Grower School in Nashville, North Carolina.
Yep,
And
I
you
remember that. I
taught
remember
me,
you also saying
yeah,
to me that you had no idea what a Rose Talk was doing at an organic garden seminar.
exactly. And
That's I
ta-da,
was an
here we are.
oxymoron to you.
So, guys, I want you to all know he is my rose mentor. So, this is a true pleasure to be here.
Well, that's very kind of you and stuff. Well, you've got a lot of gardening background between Southern Living Magazine and now David Austin Roses, and you know you bring a lot to the table. So let's dive right in because we've got a lot to cover. We're going to talk about new roses and all kinds of great stuff. But let's talk a little bit about David Austin Roses itself, because there's been a couple big changes at David Austin, and certainly over the last 2.5 years. One is our
Mhm.
mutual good friend Michael Marriott, who was the, I don't know, a technical director, Rosarian, a little bit of everything. I think Michael wore a lot of hats, needless to say. Retired last year, and that's a lot of knowledge that leaves the nursery with Michael.
It is. And anyone who knows David Austin's in the United States and worldwide adores Michael. He is still consulting on his own, so he could not completely hang up his hat, but he has retired from this position. We totally wish him well. He has just, I can't thank him enough for all that he has done for the brand in the United States. Just an amazing man.
Yeah, he is. I met him for the first time, oh my gosh, 24 years ago, I think, for the very first time. And we've been friends
Wow.
ever since. And he's come, he stayed at the house and visited and just he and I are very like-minded in the way that we approach rose growing. So I think that's what clicked the friendship right out of the gate. And then, like you said, he's just a wonderful, wonderful person.
Exactly, and charming, the absolute wonderful British gentleman, and going back to what you're saying with like-minded, he is just fantastic with growing roses sustainably, and has always stood by that too.
Yeah, and that's we actually talked about that the first time we ever met, and when this was back in like the
Hmm.
late '90s when nobody was doing it, and we were like, really,
Right.
really, that's great. I'm so excited. So that's why. So
Exactly.
I joined Utah, wishing Michael well. He and I still email correspond, and I know he's consulting and he's busy, and I think it's kind of funny. I think he's surprised how busy he is, and I'm like, you're Michael Marriott. Of course you're busy.
Exactly, exactly. People, I don't know if people know where he lives, but they totally have that email address.
Yeah, they do. Oh yeah, you can get him. You can hold him. So that's one. The other one was obviously a sad one. David Austin
Yes,
Sr., the founder of the nursery, creator of the English Rose line, passed away about 2.5 years ago. He was about
he sure
95,
did.
if my memory serves, I believe.
Yes, and I mean, he set the bar for so many rose breeders and rose lovers out there. Um, the amazing thing about Mr. Austin, he policed himself. We all go, oh my gosh, I love this so much. When I went over to England to interview, and they were taking me through the trialing fields, which is heavenly, as you can imagine, they pointed out this amazing vermilion colored rose. And they said, what do you think of that? And I was like, I've never seen anything this color before. This is phenomenal. And they were like, yeah, this was being ramped up for Chelsea. And Mr. Austin just didn't feel good about something that he saw reoccurring. And he pulled it at the last minute. And that's how he was. He always had not the professional gardener in mind, not the show table in mind, but the novice gardener. He really wanted to make them successful and to have roses that look better over time. A lot of roses you buy and they look great the first day they're in the garden and they go downhill, but he wanted his to look better over time. So an amazing man.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, I've always felt, having been around a lot of rose breeders in my life, the
Mhm.
best rose breeders are the ones that have a vision and stay to that vision. They
Right,
may do some
right.
adapting here and there, and certainly Mr. Austin did in terms of color variants that he began to introduce. I remember when Lady Emma Hamilton came out, it was like, oh my gosh, this is a
Hmm.
whole kind of different
Yeah,
color group for David Austin. But there was the
yeah.
definite distinct vision that he continued to improve on over time. And I think
Hmm.
that's, and he basically invented a class of roses. So, it goes
Yeah,
beyond just the roses, his legacy, to me at least, personally. The other thing I
right.
felt that David Austin did, because I started growing his roses in Los Angeles back in the mid '90s, when they first
Yeah,
kind of came on the radar a little bit, is
right.
that he made he gave permission for gardeners to grow roses in perennial borders, because the United States for
Absolutely.
so long was like, oh no, you have to have a rose garden and your perennial garden's over
Yeah,
here. And he said, no, no, no,
yeah,
no, no, you put them all together. It's more common in England, but in the United
yeah.
States, it was really rare back then. And he said, no, I
It
want them
sure
in with
was.
perennials, and that's what they're bred to do, and that's when they look their best. And we're going to talk about companion planting later on in this episode, but I just wanted to, that to me was another part of his legacy that I'll never forget.
You're exactly right. He wanted roses to be an integral part of the garden. We have a saying, our roses play well with others.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's what he had in mind.
Yeah, and it's, as I always say, a rose is nothing more than a flowering shrub. That's
That's
really, that's
exactly
and that's how
right.
you want to use it in the garden. And that brings me to my next question: is what's the continuity of the breeding program now that Mr. Austin is gone?
Well, Carl Bennett, who was Mr. Austin's right-hand man, started with David Austin when he was 18 years old. He lived in a neighboring farm and began working with him. He was with him for 35 years prior to Mr. Austin's passing. So they were simpatico. They knew exactly what each other was looking for, what they wanted. Now, Carl has continued on with a breeding team that was also there while Mr. Austin was still alive, and they are continuing forward with his wishes and what he saw for the future. When Mr. Austin passed away December 18th, 2018, he had a very good idea of really what was going to come forward for the next 10 years. So he knew what was in the works. He knew what he was excited about. And, we'll talk about this a little more later. But when he introduced Olivia Rose Austin, that kind of was his big aha moment. And that really kind of shifted the direction of our entire breeding program because he found what he'd kind of always been looking for, which was phenomenal.
That's a great tease. I like that.
Yeah,
That's a real good one.
yeah.
And we are going to jump into that later as well, because we're going to start talking about not only some of the new
Yeah,
roses, but we're going to talk about a thread that you began to notice a while back when you first started with David
yeah.
Austin. But before we go on to some of the newer roses, though, what I'd like to just talk about a little bit is David Austin roses periodically take some of the older varieties off the market. And I get asked
Hmm.
that a lot, oh gosh, this one's going away, or this one's going away, this one's going away. So let's just, tackle that one head on. And I'm going to let you describe. You said there's two reasons why this happened, so I'm going to set you up. And so, why did some of the old roses come off the market?
Well, first of all, I had alluded to it earlier. Mr. Austin policed himself more than any of us do because he is focused on bringing quality to the market. All right. So he is not shy about saying, you know what, that's great, but it's not exceptional. So when you have brought forth over 200 varieties, and you're grown in 35 countries around the world or sold in 35 countries around the world, you tend to have limited field space. So a lot of it is like a brick and mortar store. there's no more room to expand. And you only have room for so many rose categories. So even though we may love some of these old favorites that maybe were named, had a grandmother's name, or it was our very first rose we were successful with, those things are gradually being phased out. I like to say being respectfully retired, because they were amazing roses in their time. Now, are they 100% going away? No, not fully. Many of them will be grown in very limited supply and sold at davidaustinroses.com. But on the wholesale side of things, which I oversee, what we really try to focus on is bringing about the best 50 to 60 roses that we know are exceptional in the US market, and offering those to our wholesale customers, which are the independent garden centers.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, I'd always heard that
Mhm.
he was so specific. If he had a rose in a certain shade and it was good at its time, then he has another
Right,
rose in that certain shade that is not only has better characteristics that he feels makes improves upon that color. He'll retire the old one, including I know when we were
exactly.
chatting in the pre-show, he retired the one named for his wife. So I think that tells you it's that's
It,
focus. I think.
it
But
really is. And
yeah.
as we start kind of looking at some of these newer varieties that have come out, and a lot are going to be very familiar to your viewers, but then some of them are going to be, very new. They're not even available in at retail yet. You're going to kind of see a thread. And one of the things that Mr. Alston absolutely loved was British literature and Shakespeare. And I try to tell people, he did not always go for the highest petal count and the biggest flower. A lot of times people new to David Alston go, oh, they must be heirloom roses. No, they're a cross between the old species roses and modern roses. Okay. The next fallacy is they say they have high petal count. Well, a lot do, but not all do. All right. Are they all fragrant? Absolutely. They're 5 fragrance profiles. Are they disease resistant? Yes. And the newer ones are more so than the older ones. But here's something I want you to pay attention to. Going back to that love of literature and Shakespearean plays, these are really characters on the stage. When you start really looking at what he brings as a new introduction, they each have their own personality. Some of them are the lead character, other make wonderful supporting characters in the garden. And I hope you'll pick up on that as we start talking about this as we move forward.
I've actually never really thought of it that way, but you're right. That makes
Yeah,
perfect sense. Yeah, I mean, all the
yeah.
characteristics I know. Some are higher petal count, some are smaller, some are bigger. You've got
Hmm.
variations there.
Hmm.
But yeah, I've always known
Right.
about the literature names. I've always recognized that. Well, that'll be fun as we start looking at
Yeah.
some of the newer roses.
David Austin has left quite a legacy to those of us who love roses. And it's nice to know that with Carl and the team, that legacy will continue to grow and build over time and over years to come. But now let's talk about something a little different. What exactly is an English rose, and are there some care tips that are maybe a little specific? So let's go back inside and find out.
So the first thing I noticed when I started growing David Austin roses back in the '90s, and I had a rose care company in Los Angeles, is they are different from hybrid teas and floribundas. You've got to treat them differently. You've got to prune them differently. You've got to take care of them differently. You got to work with them differently. And I fell in love with them because I also love the old roses. And we actually became known as the
Hmm.
folks who knew something about David Austin roses, which was a great little hitch for us because they were just taking off like a wildflower in Los Angeles. So tell me a little bit about what makes an English rose as opposed to a hybrid tea.
Absolutely. So we mentioned earlier, they are a cross between the old species roses, which the colors were like white blush and kind of a crimson tone, and modern roses. So that's kind of everything else. And Mr. Alston did that because he wanted to increase repeat bloom. He was looking also for some disease resistance. He was looking for a wider color range. So you will see characteristics of a lot of different types of roses within the David Austins. For instance, Queen of Sweden has a lot of hybrid tea parentage. And for those of you who are familiar with her, she has a very upright form, which is a nod to that hybrid tea. But then, there are crosses with floribundas and intercrosses. So it really brings forth a resilient, adaptable rose that, is stronger than either original group.
Yeah, I remember reading in a book. It was, in fact, I've got it here somewhere. It's actually one of my prized possessions because David signed it to me, actually, as a matter of fact. They talk about, I think it was 6 different strains that he identified. I think there was an Alba
Mhm.
strain, a hybrid musk strain, and
Mhm.
and things like that. And that's
Right.
and they just have that charm. And the other thing, I'm going to get a lot of letters for this one. The other difference between David Austin roses and hybrid teas, foliage.
Yeah.
David Austin actually has it.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and I'm kidding.
But
Hybrid teas have foliage as well, but David Austin is an attractive plant even when it's not in flower. To me, the
yeah.
very definition of a garden rose.
That's exactly right. And when we are selecting what's going to come forward, that foliage comes into play. And as we start showing you some photos of these, I'd like you to take a look. Some of them have very round foliage. Some of them have more elongated foliage, dark green, medium green, and that all comes into play with the design in the garden too, and the disease resistance. So he normally likes, I think some of his older varieties had thinner leaves. The newer ones, you're seeing a thicker, a little more disease resistant type leaf. But he always looks for the flower petals that are like alabaster or porcelain where light passes through them so nicely.
That makes sense, yeah, because they are beautiful when lit from
Hmm.
behind by the setting sun or something
Hmm.
like that. They have a really, really nice case all their own. So, well, let's talk about a few care tips. And I think the biggest one,
Hmm.
since David Austin likes literature, the bud union, to bury or not to bury.
Exactly. It is to bury. And
Yes.
I think, Paul, both you and I are still shocked at how many people and really knowledgeable rose people, when you tell them that, they're like, what? Excuse me? When I went through college, I did not learn it that way. If I'd answered it that way, but the cool thing about science and the cool thing about horticulture is that it keeps us all humble. And we know now that is truly the right way to do it.
Yeah, and that's in any climate whatsoever. Whether it's a
Yes.
warm climate or a cool climate. And there's a
Hmm.
couple things that I've always theorized about that. One was actually Michael Marriott was the one who talked to me about that, which is you bury the bud union to prevent what he called wind rock. And what
Yes.
is wind rock? So if this is your bud union and you're at soil level here, the only thing you've got supporting this rather large plant potentially is this one shaft sticking out of the ground. And the
Yeah.
wind can start to do this to it. Now imagine if this is the bud union here and the soil level's here with all the canes, now you've got a much more stable base that's going to hold that plant in place and potentially not tip
Hmm.
out if you get a long wind. The other thing that
Hmm.
with budded roses is if you bury the bud union, they will eventually revert to their own roots. They will
Yes.
just start to put out their own roots. And I've always theorized that a lot of times where bud unions weren't buried because some roses were not capable of living without that artificial
Hmm.
rootstock. In America, it's generally Dr. Ewing
Hmm.
is what it generally is. And I think that
Hmm.
has a little bit to do with it as well, because if you bury a rose that can't survive on its own roots, then over time it's going to deteriorate if you bury the bud union.
You're exactly
Yeah.
right.
But
And I mean, it's kind of like getting the best of both worlds. You have that graph that gets you going, and then when you are planted at the correct level, you now are developing your own roots, and ta-da, then your rose is really going to be stronger.
yeah, and it's gonna live longer. It's longevity, and to me,
Hmm.
roses on their own roots also put out more canes. I feel you get a fuller bush out of an old root rose. And of course, if you have
Right.
winter dieback and issues like that, you don't even have to worry about it, things like that. So that's going to bring us to pruning. And again, when I began working with the David Austin roses back in the mid 90s, I noticed that you can't you can prune some like a hybrid tea. You certainly could.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk more about, and I think this is your gardening background, is what I'm seeing here.
Yeah.
You talk more about pruning for garden location. So what exactly does that mean?
So the easiest thing you can do, I think people are terrified of pruning because they think they're going to do something that kills the rose. Roses are so tough. So let's say that you've got it in a perennial border or it's in with mixed shrub border. A lot of times with a hybrid tea, you would go in, take out dead, disease, dying, open up the center for air circulation, make sure it's perfectly symmetrical. With a garden rose, you don't need to do that. Just step back. You're still going to want to take out dead, disease, dying first. That's a great place to start. Brand new roses, say that are a year old, you're really not going to prune them that much. Just kind of shape them up a little bit. Year two, you're going to do a little bit more. By the time they are settled in year three and on, and they've kind of are developing their character in the garden, step back and just take a look at the position in the garden. Do you need to kind of reduce it by a third or a half? Go on and do it. Well, let's say there is a spirea or rudbeckia that's kind of growing and infringing on it. It's okay to trim one side of your rose back a little more than the other side. Let's say you've planted 3 of them in a mass and they're starting to grow together. That's a fantastic thing. Trim them. So, and notice I'm saying trim rather than prune because I kind of want you to start thinking in that aspect of it, that you don't have to separate out each plant. You can make them appear to be one large mass in the garden, and that is okay. So just take a moment, step back, trust your eye, and trim or prune accordingly.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, if you've got a rose at the back of the border and you want it to be 4 or 5 feet in the
Mhm.
spring, don't prune it back to 18 inches. Like you
That's
said, maybe
exactly
reduce a
right.
third. Again, dead, disease,
Yeah.
dying, of course, comes out. And that's a
Yeah.
good place to start with deadwood because you can't make a mistake. It's dead.
Hmm.
You're not going to say, oh, I'm going to glue that back on. So
Right.
yeah, and that's I think the thing to do. And I think that's the other important point I think to think about that is, and again with the David Austin roses, and particularly if you can get to some of the old garden roses and things like that,
Hmm.
is research how big they ultimately want to get to before you figure out
Yeah.
where it's going to go in the garden. Because if you've
You
got
are.
a rose like a Gertrude Jekyll, for example, which can get very
Hmm.
tall,
Yeah.
it's not going to be happy being pruned to 3 feet high all the time.
Right.
So
Right.
that's but you do the same with plants. You approach them like you approach a plant. I always say if you were
Right.
looking for foundation planting, you wouldn't put a pansy
Hmm.
down because you like the blue flower.
Hmm.
You pick the
Hmm.
plant that's appropriate for the spot.
Most David Austins are not going to be ground. I'd say 99.9% David Austins are not going to be the very front of the border. The lion's share of them range between, I'm going to say, 3.5 to 5 feet tall. Most of them are hovering in that 4 foot tall height. Now, that said, depending on your area of the country, how much sun, how much heat you have, um, they can get bigger than that. They might be a little bit smaller than that. So they're really kind of a good mid-border shrub. Things like Lady of Shalott and Teasing Georgia have what I call split personality. They can be big, arching back of the border shrubs, or they can be trained as climbers. And you will see a lot of our roses um, uh, kind of marketed both ways. So, Paul, you taught me something in that class, that very first class, and I have picked up on it. Before you go buy a rose, what do you want your rose to do for you? And that way you can start thinking about, I need something more upright or something that could be a hedge, or I need something that's more rounded to kind of fill in this border, or I actually have limited space. Maybe we should go upward with a climber. So before you just kind of go crazy and start putting a lot of stuff in the cart, whether online or in the store, think about what you want that rose to do in the garden. And then that gives you a hint as to what to buy and then how to prune it.
Yeah, it's what's the rose's job? That's the expression that I always use. What's the
Yes.
job of this rose going to be? And it is important though to climate specific, because I remember the first three David Austin roses I bought were Gertrude Jekyll, Graham Thomas, and Mary Rose.
Yeah.
Mary Rose behaved according to plan.
Right.
Gertrude Jekyll did not.
Yeah.
Graham Thomas was a really bad boy because at the
Yeah.
time it really hadn't been grown in America much, and I was living in Los Angeles then, which everything tends to get a little
Oh.
bit bigger. So I
Oh
bought a
yeah.
Graham Thomas and thinking, okay, it's gonna be a nice 5 to 6 foot shrub. That'll be lovely. So
Yeah.
I lived in a duplex at the time, and we lived upstairs. So I had in the courtyard, I put a big old pot, huge pot,
Yeah.
and I planted Graham Thomas in it. And within 2, 3 years, it climbed to the second story balcony.
Exactly.
So
And
I look at
now
a 6 foot shrub going, really? That's
and
15 feet high
now
now.
we just say it's a climber. You
Yeah.
know, when David Austin Jr. trained me, and when he came to the US and was looking around, and when anyone from England has come over here to travel with me, it's the same genetics, it's the same
Mhm.
plants. They are blown away by how big the canes are, how tall the flowers are, and even how much bigger some of the actual blooms are. And they're like, wow, our roses really do love the US.
Yeah,
And
they
and
do.
they
They
admit that some look better here than others that are over in England. So
and we won't edit that out either. So
no, no.
they do, but that's what makes them. I mean, Gertrude Jekyll to me, I always tell people it's a great small climber, or a pillar rose. It's great for that as
Yes,
well. Great for pegging.
absolutely.
They're really good roses for picket fences and that kind of low
Hmm.
4 foot kind of fence, because they don't overwhelm the
Hmm.
fence. Like some climbers can just
Yeah.
get 15 feet and just take over a fence.
Yes.
They're just not meant to be
Yeah.
like that. But I like to
And
use them a lot that way, on like a low fence.
yeah, and you're spot on with that statement. You can take a shrub that, let's say, is supposed to get 4 to 5 feet tall, and train it on that little white picket fence like it's a climber. Just start pick out your key canes and start picking them out, and training them to go horizontal along that fence, and it may save you a lot of time pruning something like a Graham Thomas that you just have to stay on top of. But within that climber group, like Strawberry Hill is a little bit smaller. And when I first joined uh, David Austin Roses, it was being marketed as a shrub, but in essence, it really likes a little support. So that would be a good, a smaller climber for someone to opt for.
And that also gets back to what you were talking about earlier, which is, don't prune it hard for the first 2 or 3 years. Let the rose
Right.
reveal its characteristics. And
Yes.
they can be very climate specific, the David Austin roses. And by doing that, if all of a sudden you think, okay, this is a mid border rose, you mentioned Strawberry Hill, for example,
Hmm.
all of a sudden it starts to check out long shoots. You're thinking, okay,
Hmm.
this is now either a pillow rose or it's a climber. And the joy of
Right.
roses is that particularly when it's only 2 or 3 years old, if you say, okay, you can actually move the rose, and I've got videos on that, you can
Hmm.
take a look at that, and actually relocate it to a space that now has that short picket fence or something along those lines.
Yes.
And I actually want to spend a little time talking about climbers, because you and I both
Yeah.
love climbing roses. We love to use, gardens to me are made beautiful by when they go vertical. It's
Oh,
not just always this
absolutely.
horizontal flat. But we're going to be talking about main canes and laterals. And that's very,
Hmm.
very specific to climbing roses, that you understand what they are. So what I'm going to do is take the folks outside into my garden, because I'm getting ready to prune. I'm going to show them real quickly the difference between main canes and laterals. So come with me.
Okay, now that you've joined me in the garden, I can explain to you the difference between main canes and laterals. The main canes are these. These are the ones that form the structure of the rose. They generally come from the base or maybe the bottom foot, 18 inches of the rose, something like that. The laterals are these. These are the side shoots. Here, you kind of see them here. Here's my main cane, right here. That's a lateral coming off the side right there. That's a lateral coming right off the side there. That's a lateral coming off the side. So the main canes come from the base. The laterals grow off the main canes. That's the difference, and that's all you need to know.
Now that you know the difference between main canes and the laterals, I want Rebecca to explain why it's important, as she mentioned earlier, to take the main canes and make them more horizontal.
Well, the whole reason you're going to do this is to get something we call a lateral. What Paul was showing you, that's the little stem that comes off that main cane, and that's what's going to give you your flowers. When I first started growing roses and I first had a climber, I I trained those canes to go straight up the wall in a fan, and all I got were roses at the very tips. And I was like, this isn't anything like the photographs. What's going on? When I started training them back to at least like a 45 or doing the switchback up and down my fence, that's when I was like, aha, this is what they're talking about. So it makes a tremendous difference.
Yeah, I always say anywhere from horizontal to 45 degrees, and I the coin though. I
Mhm.
always call that's the bloomerama zone, is what I call that.
That's
It's what you can,
exactly, I
that's like
love it, the Bloomerama
that's the
zone.
bloomerama zone, yes. And that's what it is. So yeah, it's like you said. I always
Yeah,
tell people if you're training it against the wall, picture the ribs of a Chinese fan.
yes,
That's
yes.
that's that's what you want. That kind of spread out like that,
Mhm,
or
mhm.
horizontally, or like you said, the switchback. If you're going up a short, like a 4 by
Yeah,
8 foot trellis, put the rows in
right.
the middle, and then take the canes and weave them this way in that 45-degree angle, and that's going to give you that wall of flower, as opposed to like you said, where to stop and smell the rose, you got to get a step ladder out.
Exactly. And that is probably when I used to be able to do garden seminars for folks pre-COVID. Um, that's my number one question. Why do I only have flowers at the end of my main canes? And that's the reason right there. Now you will all have a garden full of beautiful climbers.
And it'll look just like the photographs. So
Exactly.
that's well, I
Pretty
like that.
close.
So we talked about some things. Bury the bud union. These are different from
Uh-huh.
hybrid teas. Garden use, pruned by garden
Hmm.
location. Give them 2 or 3 years to settle in and identify to
Yes.
you what their characteristics are going to be in your garden. And do remember the difference between main canes and laterals. And also with main canes, when you prune
Hmm.
your rows, don't cut your main canes back.
Those are some great care tips. I know they're going to help you get the most out of your English roses. But when I was talking to Rebecca pre-show like 2 weeks ago when we were kind of setting this thing up, she brought up a subject that she noticed all of a sudden maybe 10, 12 years ago, a thread that she saw through the roses, the David Austin English roses, that was a sense of continuity. And it was really interesting to find out.
Yeah. So about 12 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, at David Austin, they said, what would happen if we stopped spraying? Because they're a breeder, they've always had to spray because some things are disease resistant, some things aren't. And when they quit spraying a portion of the fields, they were shocked. Some of the old favorites were riddled with disease, and they're like, wow, this is going to change our breeding program. And it has had a massive impact because not just here in the US, but in 35 countries around the world, so many people are becoming more conscientious. What are we doing about our bee population? What are we doing for our kids? A lot of huge metro areas don't even allow garden centers to spray anymore. So it was imperative to bring forth varieties that had better disease resistance than we did.
I think and that's a big thing to stop spraying the test fields. I mean, that takes some
Hmm.
courage to certainly do that. But I think we're all
Oh,
going to be
yeah.
better for it because now they know exactly which ones are disease resistant, which ones aren't, because they just quit spraying them completely. So I think that's great. And I
Exactly.
noticed, you talked about you noticed this thread of disease resistance coming through some of the roses when this began to happen. So what I'd love for you to do right now, instead of talking about only new roses, go back and
Yeah.
talk about some of the ones where you begin to notice that thread, and just walk us through this strain of roses that you've noticed.
Absolutely. The first is Lady of Shalott. We see her doing amazingly well from coast to coast. She takes heat, humidity, freezing temperatures, lovely apricot color, can be a climber or a large back of the border shrub. Princess Alexandra of Kent, same type of situation. Lovely shrub with huge flowers. A lot of rosarians like to put her on the show table. Amazing tea fragrance, even though she's a pink. One of, I think, our unsung heroes is Princess Anne. The two princesses kind of go hand in hand for disease resistance, but because Princess Alexandra of Kent has larger flowers, she gets more press and people like to talk about her more. But Princess Anne is phenomenal in a container and amazingly disease resistant. When Mr. Austin came out with Olivia Rose Austin, named after his granddaughter, that was his tremendous aha moment. You have something that has probably the best looking foliage he had ever brought forth to date. The remonancy or repeat on these flowers is just tremendous. It has the classic kind of English looking blossom on it and a very light fruity fragrance. So in the same year, he brought forth the Poet's Wife. That probably is one of my favorite roses in my garden. It is a lovely yellow. It tends to hold its color well, even in higher light areas. I live in Seattle, Washington, so that is like black spot central and powdery mildew central. And I do very, very little spraying, and that rose stays clean for me. So amazing citrus fragrance, and it's something that I can cut and bring in the house, and it lasts pretty well. Lady of the Lake. This is a rambler, and ramblers are so underutilized, I think because they're big. This one can get about 12 feet across. Most ramblers are bloom once, but the David Austins do repeat. And this one has a lovely fragrance to it, lots of stamens. So if you're into pollinating or having a pollinator garden, an excellent, excellent rose for you to bring in. Desdemona, oh boy, everyone loves Desdemona. Fantastic in a container. Starts out with these pretty pale pink buds and then opens up to a white or very soft pink if it's getting a little bit of shade. The incurved petals on this make it almost a chalice shape. Excellent disease resistance, wonderful old rose fragrance with hints of almond. Just, I really, really like it. Roald Dahl, named for the famed children's book author, is fantastic. It is this soft kind of James and the Giant peach coloring. The repeat on this rose is just incredibly quick. Wonderful disease resistance, and it is a shade of apricot that blends with a lot of colors. It's a good transitional shrub. Um, the petal count may not be as high as some other things, but you can put it with yellows, you can put it with apricots, orange tones, whites, and even some pinks. Remember what we were talking about with players on the stage. So a really good addition. Bathsheba is a climber that I am over the moon for. It has really kind of a pinkish and yellowish petals that make it look to be an apricot. And it has that lovely halo where the outer petals are lighter, and that was a characteristic that Mr. Austin bred for. That's probably going to get about 10 or 12 feet tall for you. Vanessa Bell, phenomenal fragrance. Now, I'm going to tell folks this. A lot of people in the US market are not gangbusters for Vanessa Bell because she has a lower petal count, but her disease resistance is top notch. Lovely pale yellow that kind of goes to a soft cream and a little yellow eye, some nice stamens in there, and green tea and honey fragrance. So very, very nice. James L. Austin, named after Mr. Austin's son, has just stunning, almost a cerise pink. Um, very, very hardy, showing that it holds its color well. I had a woman in Nevada in a highlight area say that rose has held its color all summer for me. So that's fantastic. Emily Bronte is a true beauty. I think of that flower kind of like a ballerina tutu. Lovely, soft apricot color, but what's distinct about it is a flatter flower, which really adds a nice new texture to the garden. Eustacia Vi is coming forth this year. Very, very just stunning pink, kind of a rounded form, a little more of a rounded green leaf on it. Superb disease resistance. I will tell you something about Eustacia Vi. I think she's going to do better in a shaded situation, and she is better for cooler climates. Uh, I would not, if you lived in South Georgia, I don't think I would opt for Eustacia Vi. But I think the other new introduction this year, Gabriel Oak, is your good choice. And Gabriel Oak has these just kind of old world rose flowers, nice fruity fragrance, a lot like Eustacia Vi, but just a tough grower, is standing up to pretty harsh conditions and more heat and humidity. So if you live in a hotter climate, I'd go for Gabriel Oak. So that kind of is your whirlwind tour of what I see is great that's there.
But I love that because I love the list because you cover the color range of all the different David Austin roses in that list. You cover the growth habits, like you said, some less petaled, some more petaled, and things like that. And for people out there who've been thinking to myself, or have heard that David Austin has the reputation David Austin roses, the reputation of being a little more disease prone, you've given them kind of a really nice David Austin roses starter list, which I love.
Right. And
There's one other one I want to talk about though, because when I led my rose tour at David Austin Roses 2 years ago, Michael showed me this rose in the field and it hadn't come to America yet, and that's Tottering by Gently.
I'm so glad you brought that forward. Yes.
I fell in love with this rose because one of my all-time favorite David Austin roses from way back in the day was the Alexandra rose, because it was a single, and I loved them. And I remember being in the field with Michael 12, 15 years ago, and there was a whole row of singles, and I said, "Would you please release these?" To me, I said, to me, they're wild. Call them, wild English roses. What do you want to call them? So tell us about Tottering by Gently.
Oh my gosh. Really, really amazing disease resistance. And what we're talking about, these singles, to me, it's just sunshine on a shrub. These lovely yellow flowers. You've got exposed stamens. So again, a phenomenal plant to have in the garden for pollinating. And what I think is fantastic is that if you quit deadheading kind of mid-season on, come fall, you're going to have these lovely showy hips on this rose. And I think that's stunning.
Yeah, it's a charming little rose, and
It really is.
people tend to not like singles, which I don't understand. To me, they're a charm all their own, and particularly if you're using them in a mixed border, so don't always worry about the high petal count. You talk about people not liking Vanessa Bell. I've got 3 of them in my garden. It's a phenomenal rose, and as you know, I'm sustainable. I live in upstate South Carolina. I spray zip, zero, nada, nothing. And it does really well. And James Austin is also just a power for me. I mean, that's a rose that just flowers and flowers and flowers and flowers. I also want to go back a little bit. You talked about ramblers. You talked about Lady of the Lake, and I think you hit on something. Most ramblers, as we know, ramblers from the Wichariana land ramblers and multiflora ramblers are spring flowering only. And David Austin has a strain of ramblers that repeat flower. They flower during the year. You mentioned that one. The other one that I really adore is Malvern Hills. I've always loved that rose. I've had a love affair with that rose. Yeah, because I remember I first saw it at the nursery in Wolverhampton on 2 arches as you walk through the center of the nursery. It's there, and it was just like, oh my God, look at this thing. So that's the nice thing. You've got this repeat flowering in a rambler, and the ramblers are so great because the canes tend to be more pliable. They're easier to train, and that's one of the nice things about ramblers.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that.
Exactly. So if you have a pergola or an entry gate, or you even want to let them ramble up a tree for that romantic look, great, easy kind of first rose to try if you're a little bit afraid of climbers because of that pliability.
So I think we've got a great list of roses here that you've noticed there. So it's a nice way for people who want to get into David Austin roses. Go back and look at that list that Rebecca just gave us. Keep in mind the ramblers, and please try to fall in love with the single roses because they really do have a charm all their own.
Yes.
Throughout the show, we've been talking about perennials and adding them into the roses, and the David Austin roses are so good with perennials. But I know a lot of you are new to this about bringing perennials into the garden and color and texture, all those kind of things. So let's go back in and let's talk to Rebecca about maybe some of her top tips to help you begin to figure out color combinations and things like that.
So here's my no-brainer tip. You will never go wrong if you do this. If you're already a designer, you're far beyond this, but again, it's going to work. Two analogous colors, and those are colors that are side by side on the color wheel, okay, like orange and yellow, or it could be apricot and orange, depending on how, close you want to get and how much you want to break it down, and an accent color. So for instance, let's say that you are going to put together Lady of Shalott, which is a lovely deep apricot. Okay, and then Grace, that was one of our older varieties, but a softer apricot. And then you have your accent color. That could be catmint, for instance, that is like a lavender hue, or even ornamental grasses. A lot of times we forget that foliage from grasses or things like Artemisia can actually be a color in the garden. So if you do that, you're never going to go wrong. The other thing is spiky forms tend to look phenomenal with roses. So think salvias, think foxglove, delphinium, the list goes on. You get the picture. You really can't mess up with something spiky mixed with a rose. Then I love billowing forms, and this really opens up a ton of options for you. I mentioned catmint is kind of spiky and billowy because it grows in a mound, so that's really nice. Gara is also, I think of as kind of billowy and moves around. Ornamental grasses have that billowy look. Lavenders have that billowy look to them. Rudbeckias, asters, they can have that soft kind of ethereal look. When you do those three things I just spoke of, people are going to think you're a professional and you're going to look fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's a great tip. I love the color wheel tip because that gives something
Yeah.
that people can actually look at and go, okay, I see how these two go together. And then again, you talked about the difference in forms, contrast between the spiky and the roundness of the
Yeah.
the rose shrubs and things like that, and the billowy. And I think I had a great tip that someone gave me once, which is a really interesting thing to think about. Is it's when your garden is in full bloom or your border is in full bloom,
Mm-hmm.
go out and take a picture of it, of the entire border, and then convert that picture to black and white.
Oh, yeah.
And if the
That,
garden is still interesting when it's black and white, you're onto something. If it's not, then you need to work with the contrast because the garden is about contrast, not just in
yeah.
colors, but also in shapes and forms and sizes.
You're exactly right. We all love roses and we're like, how many roses can I pack into this limited space? But I think you actually get a more interesting border by adding perennials, flowering shrubs, even tropicals in to add interest and rhythm and even some unity to the border there.
And what you just talked about actually is something that I do because I can't really plan my garden. I'm always getting roses sent to me to test and roses to try, and I wanted to try new things. So my garden plan is where's the space there. So what I did
That's
basically was
exactly right.
yeah, and so I have about maybe a palette of maybe 10 to 12 perennials that I work with. I work with Penstemon Husker's Red because I
Right.
adore the bronze foliage and the white flower. You mentioned
Hmm.
catmint or nepeta. I work
Oh,
with that
yeah.
for that billowy form. It does really well.
Yeah.
And Galbra also does very well for me as well. So what I basically do is I have taken those
Hmm.
perennials and repeated it all through. I've got 4 different gardens, and they're repeated through the entire garden. And they're picked in colors that the
That's
roses will
brilliant.
never really contrast well. And that way, even though my roses can be just a complete
Hmm.
riot of color, and you talk about analogous, they'll come to my garden. There's nothing analogous and color wise about my garden at all. But the perennials are the thread that ties the entire garden together and keeps it harmonious.
It sure is. And if you are working in any type of purple and blue tone, any type of silver or white tone, and any type of chartreuse or green family tone, that can be that unifying glue so that if you just can't help yourself, like Paul and me, and you have a lot going on, it can glue it all together.
Yeah, exactly. And blue is a classic one. Also gray foliage, like lavender and
Yeah.
artemisia you mentioned,
Yeah.
lambsy or things like that. Because there's no
Yeah.
blue roses. So that's what ties, that's why that blue
Right.
thread is just going to really work nicely together. So, all right. So we're going to begin to wrap this up, but
Exactly.
when we do, it's eye candy time. So we've got some wonderful
Eye
photographs
candy.
of David Austin roses with perennials. And I'm going to let Rebecca take us through this and explain what the pairing is and whatever tips she wants to get. So you ready? Here we go. Eye candy time.
Here we go. All right. So first we have James L. Alston. Look at this stunning, bright, color-saturated flower with these asters. Remember, when you have repeat blooming roses, they're going to take you from early summer, sometimes late spring, all the way into fall. And so pairing with something flowers late in the season, like an aster, is a win. Vanessa Bell, I think this is a very British color scheme here with the yellows. You can see how you've got that soft yellow going down to more of a pale with the flowers, paired with a hardy geranium. Just lovely, very clean and simple. Now, I love the bold statement this one makes. This is Roald Dahl paired with Rudbeckia hirta and Saponaria. How many times do you think I'm going to take this rose and pair it with something strong and rusty colored? Often with roses, we're drawn to very pastel shades, very pretty. And I love kind of the masculinity that this lends, and it is hinting at that last flush towards the end of the season. And then finally, Desdemona. Hey, roses work quite well in large containers. This is very classic paired with boxwood, lavender, May-night salvia, and black beauty elderberry. A stunning combo and easier to recreate than you think.
Those are great. I love the photographs. I love the pairing, and I think it nicely illustrates, the contrasted form and the way the colors can work together, and the fact that these perennials just they set the roses off. They really make them
Yes.
pop out at you. So that's, I think, a great reason to put perennials in with roses. And one of my favorite quotes of all time is one of my mentors was Peter Beals, the late Peter Beals, and he always said,
Yeah.
"Don't think of companion plants for roses. Think of roses as companion plants."
Ah, I love it.
Yeah, I know. That quote is always stuck in my mind from Peter, and I think it's a great way to look at it because it kind of opens your eyes to looking at roses in a different way.
It sure does. It sure does. No, I think the main thing that we want people to know, both you and I, Paul, is that you said it best. Roses are flowering shrubs. Don't be afraid of them. Make them a part of the garden. You're going to succeed. Don't be afraid to prune or deadhead. Um, and you're going to be successful. Just go at it like you're going to have the confidence and everything's going to be great in the end.
And you said that perfectly because that's why I always tell people if you think of it as a flowering shrub, then all of a sudden all those difficult rose care things go away, and you use your own
Yes.
gardener's instincts to take care of it like you would take care of basically any other plant
Mm-hmm.
in your garden. You just treat it
Mm-hmm.
like a flowering shrub. So Rebecca, this has been fabulous. It's always fun to
Oh,
talk to you. I always know we're going to have a great conversation and we're going to go
same
off into tangents
here.
that we didn't expect, maybe, but that's okay. It's half the fun. So,
Now,
um,
what they don't know is we'll talk for an hour after this too,
yes, we
right?
will. Yeah. It'll just keep going at that point, that's for sure. But I want to thank you so
Yeah.
much, and I'm glad we were able to spend some time doing all things Austin. And I look forward to seeing you and doing it again in our future episode.
We sure will. And thank you so much for having us, Paul.